folks, and welcome back to our last session of our 6th Annual Policy Summit. And this session is one that's near and dear to the heart for many of those who are kidney allies and kidney patients that are watching today. And it's the future of transplant drug medication. I serve as the Chair of Policy and Global Affairs for the American Association of Kidney Patients. And I also happen to be a 46-year kidney patient who's lived for 26 years on a kidney transplant. My transplant came from a young person who had the courage to sign up to be an organ donor before he was struck down in a serious accident. This issue of the future of transplant drug innovation is important because U.S. national policy over the past decade has put a very heavy emphasis on organ donation. In 2016, President Obama had the White House Summit on Organ Donation, and that was a very important White House meeting because it convened the entire kidney community and the transplant community to put an emphasis on transplantation and what more can be done to remove barriers. Then in 2019, with Secretary Azar as the architect, we ushered in the executive order on advancing American kidney health, which made a priority on kidney transplantation and also anticipated artificial organs. But the important thing here is this: the therapeutics that kidney patients depend on once they get a transplant, many of them are dated on technologies that are older, in the 1980s and in the 2000s. And so the future of transplant medications and what can be done to make certain that the graft upon which the transplant survives inside the person can last as long as possible. The ideal being that the transplanted organ goes for the natural life of the patient that it goes into. And innovations that can reduce the side effects that happen for many transplant drugs. These are very important issues. One, because of our national priority of more organ transplants, but also the harsh reality that we're facing of so many people that are on the transplant list. As a country and as policy activists, we should be doing everything possible we can to increase organ donation and look at the innovations that reduce the need for retransplantation and people going back on to the organ donation list. So in 2018, the United States Food and Drug Administration leaned forward into this issue. They brought together patients from across the country, transplant patients and organ donors and medical professionals. And they asked about the unmet needs in the transplant community, and especially for patients, for donors, and for patients. And in that meeting of the FDA, folks were very candid in saying what the unmet needs were. They wanted innovations. They wanted organs to last longer. They wanted less side effects. And organ donors have a very important voice in this, because they want to make certain that their gift of life lasts and helps people go back to work and to pursue their aspirations. These are very important issues. But we're at an important juncture now, because after 5 years of effort, the Transplant Therapeutics Consortium, which we'll hear from here shortly, has been working very hard to develop other endpoints so that innovation can move forward, so that we can actually anticipate new drugs. And whether or not that's approved and moves forward or not through FDA actions is a decision that's going to be made this year. And it's one that involves each of us in the kidney community, whether you're a medical professional, in industry, an organ donor, or a patient. So in order to get context to this about whether there is an unmet need or not, AAKP launched forward a national survey through our Center for Patient Education and Research. Right now, that survey is available to you on this platform to take. We've had over 1,100 responses. And I'd like to go ahead and open up this session by taking a look at some of the initial responses to that survey that highlight some of the areas of great importance, both to patients and to organ donors in the wider kidney community. So let's go ahead and take a look at our first slide. So on this first slide, what we wanted to know is for transplant recipients in advance, would they want to know how long that their transplant was going to last? Seems like a logical question. And when we asked it, 77% said, of course, we'd like to know how long a transplant might last. And then we asked them, how long do you think a transplant should last to make it worthwhile, not just for the recipient, but most importantly for the living donor who provides that gift of life? And the number I would call you to is at the very bottom. For those who say it should last more than 20 years, 47%. For those who said it should last between 10 and 19 years, 37%. And between 5 and 9, 10%. And between 1 and 5 years, 5%. One of our guests will talk about the importance of that issue of 1 or 5 years here in a few minutes. We asked those that we surveyed what their medical teams had told them in terms of how long a kidney would last if they adhered to the regimen of immunosuppression and took care of their transplant. Again, I'd call your attention down to the bottom. For transplant professionals who were telling the recipients how long it would last, 15% indicated more than 20 years, about 58 or 60% indicated 10 to 19 years, and then you can see the number there, about 23% of 5 to 9 years. And then we asked kidney donors this very simple question. If you donate and give the gift of life, what's your expectation for how long a transplant should last? Should it last beyond 1, 3, 5, or more years? 94% said, of course. Yes, it should last. Only 6% said no. And this is a rather long question, but it's an important one. We asked those that were taking the survey this question, that if the Food and Drug Administration adopted a new primary or co-primary clinical endpoint that could lead to new innovations in transplant that are better than the current treatments or status quo treatments, and that improve the safety and the graft survival of the transplanted organ, do you think organ donors, family members, loved ones, friends, anonymous people, would be more likely to donate a kidney to someone with kidney failure or on dialysis? 74% said yes, 22% were not certain, and only 4% said no. And then we asked this question of our survey respondents, that if the Food and Drug Administration were to adopt new primary or co-primary clinical endpoints that could lead to new innovations that limited the side effects, things like hypertension and diabetes and cancer and tremor and hair loss, do you feel more dialysis patients, those who are living day to day on dialysis, do you think they'd consider pursuing a kidney transplant more? 89% said yes. And then we asked this final question. We asked our respondents, did you know that the criteria that are being used and were used to develop new drugs in the transplant space right now, the current therapies that people are taking, have their roots back in the 1980s, 40 years ago, and back in the 2000s, 20 years ago? Only 31% understood that. 69% did not know that. The point that I would like to make is, I think as people know that innovation has not happened in the field of transplant medications for decades, I think more and more people will be inclined to ask the question, why not? And the other important question to ask is, should living organ donors and patients have to wait another 10, 15, or 20 years to see more innovations in the drug space? Our contention as the largest patient organization in the kidney community is absolutely not. Innovations in transplant medications should be proceeding at the exact same pace as innovations in other therapeutics and devices focused on kidney patients. There's no reason why, in the decade of the kidney, we should have slowness or delay on new innovations in transplant therapies. We expect it. Patients are asking for it. And 5 years ago, the patient community, the living donor community, and the professional community provided that feedback to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The U.S. FDA has done a fantastic job leaning forward into patient communities to gather their insights, to listen and respect and elevate their lived experiences. We hope that this survey further informs their decision-making and their information. And we also hope that these notions that somehow there's not an unmet need among patients are put to rest. Let me tell you this. I've had a kidney transplant for 26 years. Every single day when I get up, I hope that it continues. I wouldn't want my transplant to end. I would like it to end at the end of my natural life. I would like it for my friends and my colleagues and so many of the patients I work with across the country to have some level of certainty that they won't have the same side effects that they've heard about, or that they will have an organ that lasts, that they won't have to go back on a transplant waiting list. And they won't have to hear the comments of people say, well, hey, if your transplant fails, you can always go back on dialysis. It is simply not an equivalent therapy. And take it from me, I lived on it for 3 years. It's just not. Transplant, for those who are medically eligible, is the best type of therapy. I'd like to go ahead and open up our panel discussion now with somebody that I caught on travel, Ericka Downey, one of our absolutely fantastic patient advocates. She's a living donor, and she donated her kidney to a person in need. And you might know the name, Billy Gillespie, a basketball coach with background at Texas A&M, Kentucky, and Texas Tech. Let me go ahead and throw it over to Ericka so we can have a conversation. Hey, thanks again, Ericka, for joining us. We really appreciate it. One of the things that AAKP has always advocated for is high-quality kidney care, and how we define that is matching treatments to the aspirations of individuals. And your story is compelling, and I want to know how your donation and your act as a living donor has aligned and helped the aspirations of your recipient, and how it's changed your life as well.
Absolutely. That's a great question. When I became aware of my transplant recipient's story, he had been sidelined from his passion and his mission in college basketball. At the time, he was coaching at Ranger College, a junior college in Texas, and had gone to the hospital thinking he had pneumonia and was being treated for that when they told him that he had stage 4 renal failure. We know that kidney disease is often called the silent killer because the symptoms are silent. You don't have a lot of symptoms with renal failure. And so that was the beginning of our story from a transplant standpoint. So he had been taken away from college basketball completely. When I decided that I was going to move forward with donation, there's no guarantees, right? There's no promises that he would return back to college coaching. However, through this decision, not only has it impacted my life and the blessings that I've been able to receive through the relationship of this connection, but in March of 2020, I introduced Coach Gillespie as at his press conference for a Division I coaching at Tarleton State in Texas. And so what he thought was the end of his story and the end of his college coaching career has now brought him back full circle, back to Division I coaching. And I've been able to play a big part of that just through the relationship.
That's exactly kind of the impact that I think our audience likes to hear, because it inspires people to take action. And one of the things that we're trying to do here is build consensus around the unmet needs of both kidney donors and kidney patients who are recipients of an organ donation around the next generation of transplant drugs. And so one of the things that's uncertain when folks get a transplant is how long it might last, and some of the potential side effects. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on our panel and in front of our audience today is because I think that sometimes people think that those unmet needs, like how long a kidney might last and what side effects are, might only be of interest to the recipient, but they're also of interest to the donor. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like, that's the one question, like even now after donation, that I'm concerned about is if one day I'm going to wake up and Coach Gillespie is going to have to tell me he's going back on the transplant list. I think it's a very big concern. And so, there is that hope that they would last a lifetime, but we also know things happen outside of our control that might prevent that from happening. And so just from the relationship that's been built in my situation, not knowing my recipient, to building a family-like relationship, that it is important to me. I care about that individual and I want them to live their life to the fullest. And so if there's anything that removed basketball from Coach Gillespie, and he's a single man, he has family but no children, and so really this is his passion. It is his dream. It is everything to him. And so I feel like if you took that away and he had to go back to dialysis, and I say back, he never was on dialysis to begin with because the kidney transplant happened so quickly after him finding out. But if he was chained to dialysis for the rest of his life, basketball would be taken away from him, and that would ultimately impact his life long term. And so just the ability for organs to last a lifetime with the drugs that and medicine, the way that it can prolong that is of utmost importance to me because of it's personal now.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because for those who are able to proactively get a living donor to donate an organ, it's vitally important. And you were able to do that for Coach Gillespie. But let me ask you at a personal level how you feel about one thing that we're hearing. So, most of the stakeholders that are involved in innovations for new transplant drugs are all in alignment that it is an unmet need, that we need to do more to make certain that those precious gifts that we have, that when they're donated, that they last the lifetime, that we have less people going on the transplant list to get retransplanted. But one of the things that we're hearing from some of our allies and stakeholders is that among some officials, this comment comes up. Well, if a transplant fails, the person can always go back on dialysis, as if that's acceptable. When you hear something like that as a living donor, what's your first reaction when you hear that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. Now, it's a blessing that Coach Gillespie and I crossed paths when we did. So he was never chained to dialysis and was able to return back to college basketball and ultimately gave him his life back. Um, I don't make light of that, but dialysis is a short-term treatment. It should not be something that is lifelong. We have the technology, and I think it's so impactful too to understand that our surgery was on a Tuesday. I went back to work the following Monday. I was off for 6 days from work, and my company fully supported that time away. And so there has not been an impact negatively in my life at all from transplant. I keep a watch on my labs. My creatinine is within normal range. And I know that maybe I'm a unicorn in that sense with how my health and going back, didn't take any opioids. I mean, the list goes on and on about my personal lifestyle and how little change it has affected me. But on the positive impact that Coach Gillespie has had through this transplant and giving his life back, his passion back, what I would say is his mission field back. That would not be possible if dialysis were in the picture. And then you start to factor in quality of life. Do these individuals, once they feel like there's no hope, do they start to fall into depression? Do they start to lose the will to live? And I feel like there's such complexities in that we have a solution with medicine. We have a solution with transplants. Why aren't we utilizing them more?
I tell you, Ericka, you are a powerful advocate, and your strength of faith and your belief in principled policy is a true blessing to Coach Gillespie and to all of us that work in the kidney space across the country and across the world. A fine example. I appreciate your time, and we'll go ahead and end this here and move on to some of our other panelists. So thank you again for joining us on your travel from Chicago and from the airport. And keep up the activity. I know you're a strong person.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a fine example of the extent that we will go to at AAKP to make certain that we get the best talent at our events, no matter where they are. If it's in an airport lounge or outside an operating room, we will get them. And that leads me to our next panelist here, Dr. Kenneth Newell. We've been close allies with Dr. Newell for over a decade. He's a leader in thought and in research and in clinical practice. He serves as a professor of surgery at Emory University. He's a transplant surgeon. He keeps it straight. He understands patients, and he really does understand the unmet needs in the field of transplantation. He's very involved in the Transplant Therapeutics Consortium. And Dr. Newell, what I'd like to ask you is, for those who are watching today, where are we on innovation in transplant medicines? And as a professional and as somebody who's been involved in driving forward new endpoints and seeing what the future could be, can you give us some insight on where we are?
Certainly, Paul. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. You can see me on the camera. I'm not a young man anymore. I've been involved in transplant actively for over 3.5 decades. And when I first started, part of what drew me to it was the innovation, the commitment of the people and the patients to make it better. In the early 90s, it was hard to do studies. There were so many new therapeutic agents out there. It was almost as if there weren't enough patients getting transplanted to test those agents. Contrast that to where we are now. So the last new class agent to be approved was belatacept that was approved in 2012 after a decade. It took a decade to get that drug from the first trials to approval. So even if we have something good, the pathway is not short. The most commonly used drugs today are all drugs that we were using in routine clinical practice in the late 1990s. When you look and say, well, what's it look like at this moment going forward? There's not a single novel compound that could be used to treat somebody at the time of their transplant as routine maintenance therapy that's in a phase 3 study. So there's nothing even on the horizon. Those phase 3 studies are what eventually can lead to a drug approval by the FDA. So you say, how did we go from being one of the most innovative therapeutic areas to one of the least? And by that I mean, if you look at the changes that have occurred in cancer therapeutics, in infectious diseases, things like hepatitis C that were unheard of, we couldn't treat it, and now it's a very, very treatable disease. It's because they've innovated in large part in their endpoints. What do I mean by endpoints? The endpoint is you do a trial, and how do you know whether that drug is better than what you have? And so you have endpoints. The fields like cancer, disease, infectious disease, autoimmunity, they have evolved their endpoints over time. We're using endpoints that you alluded to were developed in the early 1980s. If I think back to my life in the early 1980s, I hopped in the car, I fired up the cassette player, I wanted to adjust the mirror, I opened the window, I moved it with my hand. You know, I didn't have anti-lock brakes. If I got lost, I wasn't firing up the GPS to get anywhere. Those are things that are now common, huge changes that have occurred, and we're using drugs that are 2 decades or more old. The endpoints currently used are death of the patient, loss of the graft, or an episode of rejection within the first year after transplant. How did we get there? In the 80s, when those endpoints were developed, the risk of patient death in the first year was 20%. The risk of graft loss was 50%, and the risk of rejection is 80%. These endpoints helped us really improve the short-term outcomes. We're to the point now that it's a terrible loss, but death after transplants around 2%. And we're transplanting a much broader spectrum of patients, older and with more diseases than we used to. So that's really, really dramatically improved. Graft loss is down around 4 or 5%. Again, it's terrible when it happens, but way better than it used to be. Rejection is down in clinical practice to probably single digits now. So you say those endpoints were really good at helping us improve short-term outcomes when short-term outcomes were bad. But short-term outcomes have improved enough now that we've moved on to long-term outcomes. We've known for a decade that the real challenge is making grafts last longer and making the side effects of the therapies much more tolerable. But we're still using an old measure. And you achieve the tool you use, your target is what you hit. If your target's 1 year, you're going to be good at 1 year. That doesn't equate to better long-term outcomes. So I think the field really needs to shift and develop new endpoints. And we have been, as you say, working on that. It's now about 7 years in partnership with the FDA. And until recently, had great optimism that we could move this needle. But I think we're now to the point where we are encountering problems, and without partnership through patient organizations such as AAKP, I'm not confident that we're going to be able to make a change. And this will set the field back for a decade, if not more.
I tell you what, Dr. Newell, I appreciate your candor in laying it out in clear terms for our advocacy community to get a hold of. And one of the issues that you talked about was side effects. And what I'd like to do is go to our next guest, who's absolutely spectacular in terms of the number of hats that she has and the number of credentials. For the patients that who are watching us and joining us today, Karin Hehenberger is a 2-time transplant recipient. She is a medical doctor, and she is the founder of a fantastic company that we've had the opportunity to work with in several different settings called Lyfebulb. But Karin, I'd like you to go ahead and talk about the practical impacts as a patient and what you've seen in terms of why there is a need for innovation based on your experience.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel and to learn from such legendary people. thought leaders. For me, it's really on several different fronts. You mentioned I wear different hats, but the primary hat, of course, is the hat of a patient and a recipient of 3 different transplants: 2 living donor kidneys and 1 pancreas. So I've had the opportunity and been fortunate enough to have had 2 living donors give me a kidney. The first one 14 years ago, due to my type 1 diabetes that I was diagnosed with as a teenager back in Sweden. And about 20 years after diagnosis, I started struggling dramatically from kidney disease. And very, very luckily, my father gave me a kidney preemptively, so I did not have to go through dialysis at that time. 9 months after his living donation, I received a pancreas, so it rendered me insulin independent. That was, of course, a gift of life, 2 ways. The kidney saved my life. The pancreas made it worth living and kept my kidney much healthier. And I thought I was off to the races and could go back to doing what I love to do, which is working in innovation, working with patient impact, and eventually start the company Lyfebulb that you mentioned, where we're building a digital community for transplant patients. But after a year or so, which was a successful transplant, I started struggling with side effects. And the side effects were completely due to the drugs that I was placed on, which again, like Dr. Newell said, are drugs from 30 years back. Drugs that preserved my function very well in the first year, preserved my function for a period of time, but very early on caused side effects that were pretty significant and affected me. We as patients on immune suppression need to be aware of the risk of infection, the risk of certain cancers. And I think it's going to take a while before we can get rid of that immune suppressive side effects that we have to pay attention to. But the other ones that are totally related to the very drug, as mentioned, tacrolimus or CNIs, that I think are even more detrimental is the effect on long-term graft survival that we heard about. And I'll get into that because that was the reason for my second transplant. But also the more short-term effects. These drugs are supposed to preserve the function of the organ that we have received, meaning the kidney, and in my case also the pancreas. But they also cause damage very quickly. Not only the long-term scarring or the fibrosis, but also the effect on the beta cells in the pancreas, meaning the toxic effect and the risk of diabetes. It's a paradox that receiving a pancreas and getting a drug that could attack that very organ. And then on the kidney, the effects of hypertension that very quickly affected me. I was lucky with my pancreas, it's still functioning. But I was very quickly, after my kidney transplant, back on antihypertensives, back on drugs that kept my blood pressure normal. The other side effects that were pretty significant, were effects on my gastrointestinal system, effects on my ability to keep a coffee cup or a glass of water, meaning tremors. And I think for me as a professional and someone who's constantly trying to manage different things, the brain fog or the so-called cognitive dysfunction that tacrolimus really has on a majority of patients. So, those are some of the very serious side effects that I was struck with. And then after about 12 years with my kidney function started to significantly decline. And this, of course, is the very serious long-term effect, and that we're also focused on, and where we need a change in the regulatory endpoints and the change in the way that we assess transplant success, which I think is an FDA issue as well as a CMS issue and a patient management issue. Because the long-term management of kidney transplantation is more than just 1 year. It's hopefully many, many years and optimally the rest of life. So after 12 years started to decline, now I was not just on 1 antihypertensive medication, but on 3. And in the past 6 months, I was on the very high doses. I was very, very swollen. I was struggling with uremia, meaning I had nausea. I was not functioning well as a person, as an individual, as a mother, and a business leader. It affected my entire life. And at that point, I was again incredibly fortunate. Now it was my sister. So my younger sister stepped up and came from Europe to give me a kidney. And here I was, very, very disappointed. And actually, I felt a sense of shame and guilt that my kidney that I had been given by my father, who had given up a kidney. And again, he's doing very well. He went to go hiking and going to the base camp of K2 recently. And this at 78 years of age after giving one of his kidneys to me 14 years ago. So living donation is clearly possible. But here I had to ask my sister, and she did step up, and I got a second kidney only 3 months ago. So I'm very fortunate that that surgery went well, that my recovery went fast. I'm back fully and feeling great. But my biggest fear is that I again have to disappoint my donor, in this case, my sister, that I can't keep her kidney alive. And I'm doing everything I can. I'm taking my medication. I'm living a very active life, both mentally and physically, trying to stay very, very healthy, eating more carefully than I did as a type 1 diabetic, just to preserve the function of my organs. But it's not up to me. It's up to the drugs that I'm taking. And therefore, I applaud the AAKP. I applaud doctors, Dr. Newell and others who are part of the TTC and Critical Path. And I really, really ask the FDA to consider changing the primary endpoint so that more companies get involved in this space. We've seen a disappearance of major players in the biopharmaceutical space because it's not worth the money to place effort into the transplant space when the hurdles are so high to get an approval for a new therapeutic. And that, unfortunately, is what drives everything, is the financial market is moving into cancer, moving away from transplant, moving into autoimmune disease, because similar mechanisms of actions are appropriate there. So we do need to, through patient advocacy, and I think surveys, facts, and stories that we can bring to the table, showcase that life with a transplant is not a walk in the park. We are very grateful for this gift of life, but we want to preserve that gift of life for the remainder of our natural lives.
Thank you very much, Karin. Your story is compelling and very much appreciated your candor. Our next speaker is unique for us, and let me tell you why. Jonathan Haydak. Jonathan is an AAKP Ambassador. He's a recipient of a living donation from his sister. He's the 4th year into it. An interesting point on that is he got his kidney transplant on World Kidney Day. How they scheduled that, I don't know, but it goes to his genius. He is a PhD student at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. But we know Jonathan Haydak because I first met him at one of our policy summits when we first began. And he was there at the table during the day and on the second day, actively involved in discussions about innovation and how to advance policy. And Jonathan brought with him an intensity that was not missed on anybody that was in that audience. Because at that time, I believe, Jonathan, you were on dialysis. And I'd like you to talk about what it was like to approach your sister, to get a living donation, and as a researcher now, how you see this playing out in terms of innovation for transplant medicine and the need for that.
Yeah, I was just, as you were talking about that, I was reflecting at that first meeting. I was on dialysis. I was on peritoneal dialysis. So I remember loading up my car and then just heading out, bringing the bags down from the parking garage up to my hotel room. It was quite the hike. But yeah, doing much better now. Approaching my sister for the transplant, I think approaching anybody, reaching out to get a kidney, when you're on dialysis or you need one, it's a very humbling experience and it's a very personal one. very emotional. So in fact, my attitude first was I didn't want anybody to go through this big sacrifice for me to give up a kidney, because I now understand that it's not as risky as I thought it was at the time, but it's not without some level of risk. And so my sister was much more gung ho about donating the kidney to me than I was about accepting it. And I will say that after about a year on dialysis, I definitely changed my mind, because I found dialysis to just be such a soul crushing experience. I did not do well on it. So eventually, we kind of had this heart to heart conversation where she communicated that she really wanted to, and that then eventually what happened is my uncle basically sat me down and called me a bunch of names and said that it wasn't my place to deny her the gift of giving me a kidney. So then we did it. It was done on World Kidney Day, also Pie Day. So in celebration of that, I have a kidney pie every World Kidney Day. And yeah, so now I'm doing much better. And then as a researcher now, it's interesting because you get diagnosed with kidney disease, and at the time I knew nothing about kidneys, and now my PhD work is all about studying mechanisms of kidney disease. And one of the things that we even look at is the toxicity, which has been discussed here by previous panelists, but of these calcineurin inhibitors. So most people like me that have a transplant, they're on this cocktail of tacrolimus or cyclosporin and mycophenolate and some steroids. And when you look at the numbers, which are usually by 1 year and 5-year graft survival, they do pretty good. But that doesn't really speak to the long-term effect of these. We know that these calcineurin inhibitors, tacrolimus, cyclosporin, they have long-term toxicity on the kidney. So it is a bit paradoxical that the best thing you can do for your kidney health is to stick to your drug regimen, but yet these drugs also in the long term are bad for your kidney, and also all these other side effects. I know that right now I'm very careful with my diet. I try to be as active as I can to prophylactically mitigate all of these risks. But as much as getting a transplant has improved my life, and my quality of life is orders of magnitude better than it was on dialysis, the reality is it hasn't been a walk in the park, mostly because of side effects of this medication. I know personally for me, very shortly after my transplant, I got what is called calcineurin inhibitor induced pain syndrome, or CIPS. And I just could not walk because I had such just excruciating pain that was really hard to pinpoint. And then we finally found it was the drugs themselves. And then there's the whole immunosuppression side of this thing. I've had several rough patches associated with that. I've gotten a random case of cryptosporidium, this parasite, which really wiped me out. I got a random blood infection about a year ago that just put me in the hospital and really wiped me out. And then just other associations with that, having to be careful. I think a lot of times in the research setting, in the clinical setting, and even when it comes to the FDA, as has been talked about, there's kind of this disconnect. I care about the 1 year and 5-year kidney graft survival, because if my graft doesn't survive 5 years, that's pretty bad, or 1 year, that's even worse. But there are definitely measures that they're not considering. And I think maybe an extreme and perhaps contrived example comes from my days on dialysis. It seemed like my clinic cared so much more about my phosphorus levels than I did. I only cared about them if they were super high. Otherwise, I had so many other things that I felt were more important that the constant talking about my phosphorus levels just really ended up annoying me. And, I think finally the last few things I want to say is we should be very bold with the new transplant therapeutics. We should be aiming for next generation therapeutics that really knock the socks off of what we use now. I want something that provides the protection from rejection, that doesn't have all these side effects. And then I don't want something that's like ProGraft that you take twice a day to ProGraft that you take once a day. I'm sorry, that just doesn't really excite me. I think that as we enter the age of precision medicine in various fields, including the broader field of nephrology, we should be taking these approaches and applying them to transplant patients. And then finally, we should continue to push for the patient voice coming from the recipients, the donors, and the patients to be involved in all of these decisions that are stemming for changes to policy and clinical implementation.
I appreciate it, Jonathan. You have a very unique view, as does Karin. And what I'd like to do now is go to the panel and ask you each this question. I just learned from our staff that we've broken all records for Policy Summit. We have a highly representative group of congressional staff from both the Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, as well as a very large number of career officials from many different federal agencies within HHS and other agencies. And so my question that I would ask each of you is this: our national consensus policy, bipartisan, above the fray, is the ideal therapy for kidney patients with kidney failure is transplantation. And if that is in fact our national policy priority, and that is what we're working towards, protecting living donors, doing all these things to promote greater innovation, can you tell us, what would you tell the congressional staff and the career officials and appointed officials about the disconnect between national policy and where we are in innovation in transplant medicine? And what would your advice to them be? I'll go ahead and start with you, Dr. Newell.
Well, I will try not to be too controversial, but what I would say is we need to stop doing business as usual. You know, using an endpoint that's 4 decades old seems to me to be indefensible. In conversations with the FDA, they said the current endpoint meets the needs of the field and the patients. This is the endpoint of death, graft loss, and rejection. And that's not what I'm hearing today people talk about. That's not what we believe. I think when COVID came upon us, they responded rapidly, aggressively with a new approach, and I think it benefited us with new therapies, new protections, and we need to do that with kidney disease now and not wait a decade and hope somebody stumbles on some miracle cure, because I don't think it'll happen.
Thanks, Dr. Newell, and thanks for all of the work that you and your colleagues are doing through Clinical Path Institute and the TTC. It has been hard work, 5 years worth of effort, and we're looking forward to see what the outcome of that will be when a decision is made by FDA. Karin, I'd like to ask you, I mean, you have so many different unique insights to it, but you are also very involved in innovation on the drug side. You've been there as a professional and you've been there as a patient. What would you recommend to those who are watching today, who are congressional staff and career staff and appointed people in our government who are working for patients? I mean, they work for us. It's not the other way around.
Well, I first of all, I want to agree on the endpoints. That's primary, but I think that there are 2 other components, just so that I can add to Dr. Newell's response. Number 1 is that we need to give hope to those who are on dialysis. I was on dialysis only for 9 sessions, but I can tell that was not a way of living. That is a bridge, and it needs to be expressed to those patients that it is a bridge towards something better. No one should believe that they don't deserve a transplant. So I think that we have a very big disconnect and an understanding of the patient community who are on dialysis literally until they die. And we need to change that. Dialysis is a bridge to something better, and that should be clearly communicated and educated in the patient community who are on dialysis. They need to understand how to get a transplant. Then number 2, we need to change the perception of that transplant is a huge success if it works in the first few months of surgery. I applaud surgeons. I think they are many gods, the surgeons who can place an organ from one person to another and save that person's life. But transplant is a condition, and we need to equalize transplant with a condition such as rheumatoid arthritis or ulcerative colitis or type 1 diabetes. We need to treat transplant for life. It's not just a surgical procedure with a short-term outcome that is right now perceived as a success. Every communication from Hollywood and beyond shows the gift of life and the gratitude. I think that is a very important component in what we are heading toward, which is a much improved drug development. But those 2 components need to be addressed before we can get a bigger change in the perception of what transplant really is.
Thank you, Karin. And Jonathan, I come back to you because you as well You graduated through the process of dialysis. You're a transplant patient. We're fellows in that regard. And now you're a researcher. And so if you were before an audience of congressional staffers who are highly influential and career officials who are responsible for regulations and bringing new products to the marketplace, what would you tell them in terms of how your sister would feel and how you feel about the next generation of transplant drugs?
Yeah, I think, the first thing is to get the point across that a kidney transplant is not just for the individual that gets the transplant, right? It is an effort by the entire community and that benefits everybody. So, like I said, this kidney is the most precious gift I've ever had. I want it to last. My sister wants it to last. I mean, she went under the knife for me, and there hasn't been much work done in terms of the therapeutics to bring this about. And then the other point I'd make is that in championing kidney transplantation as the go-to and for all these advances is there's already so much money that is invested by the government into dialysis in kidney patients. And we know that it is usually much cheaper to get these patients off dialysis and on a transplant. And in addition to that, you really give somebody their life back when they go on transplant. They become a lot people that were out of work because they couldn't work well on dialysis. They can go back to work. They can pursue their life. They can now pay taxes. It benefits everybody in almost every way.
Jonathan, you hit it absolutely on the head. AAKP has been very distinct in the public square, saying that kidney disease is both a healthcare issue and a workforce issue. And if people don't really understand that and appreciate it, they're missing all of the aspirations that people have and that they share with their fellow citizens. I'd like to thank our panel for participating today, and also Ericka, who we caught in an airport. But each of you are experts. You are very committed to the cause of innovation, and most importantly, making certain that transplantation evolves along with all the other types of things that we're doing in the kidney space. And hats off to you.